So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Susan Smith as our first speaker tonight. Susan is a mum living in Edinburgh, looking after her 3 children. She's a former financial advisor with a career involving work in the city and on Wall Street. This was all before she became a co-founder of For Women Scotland. Through Mumsnet, Susan met Marion Calder and Magdalene Burns, and in 2018 they formed Women's Scotland, For Women Scotland. After Magdalene's untimely death, they were joined by Trina Budge. Since then, they've been fighting for women's rights, most notably challenging the definition of women and gender representation on Public Boards Scotland Act 2018, which led to the historic Supreme Court win earlier this year. They've now issued a legal challenge to the Scottish Government for the non-compliance of the ruling. For now, I will hand over to Susan.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I am one of the 3 directors of For Women Scotland, and some of you might have noticed that in April this year, with the help of Sex Matters and LGB Alliance, the Scottish Lesbians and the Lesbian Project, we won what has been described as a landmark ruling that established, shockingly, women were and needed to be protected under law of on the basis of sex, rather than whether our brains were made of fluff and sparkles and if we like ballet or football. I like ballet, by the way, so clearly I'm a real woman. When we look at the sweep of history, I always say that women's rights are pretty much in their infancy. I actually did a little mini pilgrimage the other day to the grave of Mary Wollstonecraft, her final resting place. She was reinterred next to her daughter. And I imagine she might have had something to say about what's been going on, because it's quite extraordinary that people could spend thousands of years oppressing women on the basis of their sex, only to decide that it's immaterial the minute we win equal rights under the law. Mary actually said men who are inferior to their fellow men are always most anxious to establish their superiority over women. So I think there's a life lesson there for us all. Anyway, the Supreme Court ruling's been celebrated as a moment of clarity or as the herald of an incipient fascist regime, depending on whether or not you think that allowing women safety, dignity and privacy is up there with pestilence, war and famine. So why was it a very obscure piece of Scottish legislation that had such a seismic impact? Well, I believe that some of this is a bit of an object lesson on political failure and cowardice, but also on overreach and hubris. And I hope that it will serve as a cautionary tale. Many people forget, I think, that this case that culminated in the Supreme Court was not our first rodeo. In 2022, we won our first judicial review, which should have been far more impactful than it was. The original Gender Representation on Public Boards Act, which we challenged, had defined women in the broadest possible terms. It conflated the protected characteristic of gender reassignment and sex, and basically reduced women to the name on a utility bill and pronouns. It was passed in the days when the Scottish Government thought they'd just sweep the board with gender recognition reform, and it was supposed to reflect the new self-identity norm. However, by putting it in explicitly into legislation, the lobbyists who wrote the definition in committee and their allies in government completely overreached, because they put in something that was not supported by equality law. And it allowed us an opening to go to court. And although it was finally settled in the Scottish court, it was persuasive for the rest of the UK. So it was really frustrating that most organisations just ignored it and continued to allow people to self-identify into spaces for women. Male murderers remained in female prisons, and Edinburgh Rape Crisis was headed by a trans-identified man who said that rape women should reframe their trauma if they objected to male counsellors. So at this point, the Scottish Government did us actually a favour it didn't seem so at the time, but they struck out the self-identification definition and they put in one that relied on the possession of a gender recognition certificate. At the time, they were pushing gender recognition reform through Holyrood, and they were saying in Parliament that this piece of paper didn't change your rights at all. But in court, they were saying the exact opposite. So we decided we had to keep challenging and we had to get clarity, because if nothing else, we wanted to know what we were fighting. So the Supreme Court actually ruled on a fairly narrow question, whether a subsection of the group covered by the protected characteristic of gender reassignment had changed sex for the purposes of the Equality Act. And this is another thing that people willfully miss, because most of the so-called rights that people are now saying they have lost were never under consideration at all by the court. They were only looking at the few thousand people who have a GRC. So in the wake of the ruling, some people are still desperately insisting on ploughing the illogical and incoherent farrow that is gender identity ideology. And there's also been a great deal of misinformation, as I said. I'm always astonished as well by certain individuals, some politically connected, I'll just get Liberal Democrats, Green Party, who will pop up and tell us to focus on more important matters like the economy. Great, well done, chaps, but strangely the argument never seems to run the other way. Why can they not stop trying to reduce women's status in law and focus on those things? They're not content that gender reassignment remains protected and that adaptation should be made for those individuals. They just want an access all areas pass. And unfortunately, this resistance is especially acute in Scotland. We're a smaller country, more liable to capture. We were perfect for the Denton's playbook, which some people may have heard of. And the Scottish Government has been telling us they have to wait for EHRC guidance. They don't. And the EHRC has been very clear, they have to obey the law. But they're dragging their heels. So this month we've said we will go back to the courts because at the moment we still have policies that say a man can be placed in a woman's prison based on his self-identification, even though that has been manifestly unlawful since we ran our first judicial review in 2022. The other policy we're challenging is on schools, where they are saying that boys who identify as girls can use the girls' changing rooms or identify into the girls' sporting teams. But it's not just the government and councils, although that's an important area. And so if I were to beg Labour members to do anything, it's please, please, please deal with the unions. I'm a product of a very upwardly mobile 20th century, but my grandfathers were both solid Labour union men, and I think they would be absolutely horrified that these organisations which were supposed to protect workers' rights are now captured by trendy, smug postmodernists. And I have swung between disgust and despair watching women like Sandy Peggy being betrayed by the organisations which should support her. And I'm fed up to the back teeth of hearing complaints about the Darlington nurses having to turn to organisations like Christian Concern, because if the unions were doing their job, they would not have to do that. You don't have the luxury of purity politics when you're trying to feed your family. And if anyone should know that, it's the unions. So when we started this fight, I think we thought we just have to explain the issues, the incompatible demands, and we thought that people who understood material class analysis and were instrumental in fighting on women's rights would understand. And I do have to say that many women in Scottish Labour were amongst the first people who really stood up and backed us. And Joanne is here, and she was magnificent in Holyrood. So I just think that in a world where truth and evidence and science has never been so important, especially in challenging so many misconceptions that are floating around in all kinds of areas of life, I just don't think we should hand devastating weapon to people who actually aren't that interested in the truth themselves. How can we ask anyone to trust us on the science of vaccines or the environment if we pretend we don't know where babies come from? It's not just being kind to a small number of individuals. The demands made on women is that we abandon the very language we use to define our world and the challenges we face. And I do remember Joanne saying once in the Scottish Parliament that if members wanted to have a debate about definitions of male and female, then they should have that debate openly. But of course, nobody ever did. They made these policies in the dark and they crumble at the first touch of the light. And I think, yes, we are fighting this and the light is helping us, but we do need more, and we need more people speaking out. And I'm very grateful and thankful to see so many of you here tonight. Thank you.